I was taken to the hospital with a severe headache. I called everyone, my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, but no one came. Then I received a text from my daughter-in-law. "We are on a family vacation, please don't bother us and stop being so dramatic." When they finally came back, their faces went pale as they read the note I left behind. I had just sold everything, including the damn house they wanted so much, and they would not receive a single penny from me. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. My name is Loretta Johnson. For 42 years I was a principal, a wife, and a mother. I believed my life was a serene, open book, its pages filled with the comfortable prose of love, family, and hard-earned peace. This is the story of how I discovered a secret, selfish plot written in the margins, and how I took the pen and wrote a final, devastating chapter of my own. Now let me tell you my story. The quiet in my house had a sound all its own. It wasn't the dead silence of an empty room, but a gentle hum composed of memories and the steady, resonant ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. It was the sound of a life well lived, a life I had built with my husband Robert, brick by brick, right here in the proud heart of Collier Heights. Our home, a handsome 4-bedroom structure of classic Atlanta brick and stately white columns, was more than just a house. It was a testament. It stood as a monument to 45 years of love, of raising our son Michael, and of pouring every spare dollar and every ounce of sweat into creating a sanctuary. After Robert passed 3 years ago, the quiet grew louder, the house felt larger, but it was still mine. It was still our sanctuary, a fortress of memories against the encroaching loneliness. My days settled into a peaceful, if predictable, rhythm that I cherished for its simplicity. Mornings were for Robert's garden. His prize-winning roses still bloomed with a defiant vibrancy, their velvety crimson petals a daily reminder of his patient, loving hands. I'd spend hours out there, my fingers deep in the rich, dark Georgia soil, feeling closer to him than anywhere else on earth. It was there I held our conversations. I'd talk to him, telling him about the impertinent blue jay that kept stealing from the bird feeder or the outrageous price of good tomatoes at the market, my voice a low murmur carried away by the humid Atlanta breeze. In the afternoons, I'd retreat from the sweltering heat to the cool, shaded living room, surrounded by a lifetime of photographs that served as the wallpaper of my heart. There was Michael as a gap-toothed boy in his Little League uniform, his smile so wide and innocent it could break your heart. There he was again, a lanky teenager in a cap and gown, his eyes full of dreams I prayed he would catch. And there he was on his wedding day, so handsome in his tuxedo it took my breath away, standing beside Nicole, his beautiful, ambitious wife. I used to love that photograph, the image of two families joining, of a future blooming. But lately, a shadow seemed to fall over it when I looked too long. A flicker of something I couldn't quite name, a dissonance in the happy image that unsettled me. My attempts to connect with my son had become a ritual of their own, a small, painful ballet of hope and disappointment. I'd pick up the heavy, old-fashioned telephone receiver. I never could get used to the featherlight feel of a cell phone, and my thumb would hover over his number in my contacts. A familiar knot would tighten in my stomach, a tense mix of longing and resignation. "Hi, sweetheart, it's Mom," I'd begin, forcing a cheerful, airy note into my voice when his voicemail inevitably picked up after 4 rings. "Just calling to say hello. Hope you and the family are well. Give Jordan and Jasmine a big kiss for their grandma. I was just thinking about that time we all went to Stone Mountain. Such a lovely day. Anyway, call me when you have a minute. Love you." The message was always a variation on the same theme, a carefully constructed little package of love and memory that I knew deep down would likely go unanswered. Michael was busy. He was a regional manager, a very important title that Nicole liked to mention at every opportunity, her voice dripping with a proprietary pride that always seemed to exclude me. He had responsibilities, meetings, and a demanding travel schedule. I understood that, I truly did. But a part of me, the stubborn mother part that never quite lets go, couldn't understand how a man couldn't find 5 minutes in his day to call his mother back. Just 5 minutes to close the distance that seemed to be growing wider with each passing year. It was on a Tuesday, a day that began with the same golden light slanting through the magnolia tree outside my window, that the storm began to gather. It started as a faint thrumming behind my right eye, a distant, muffled drumbeat easy to ignore. I dismissed it as fatigue. Perhaps I'd spent too much time in the sun while weeding the azaleas. I took 2 aspirin from the bottle in the kitchen cabinet and settled into my favorite armchair with a novel, the worn pages of familiar comfort in my hands. But the words on the page refused to focus. They swam and blurred, the letters seeming to lift and rearrange themselves into nonsensical patterns. The drumming in my head grew louder, more insistent, a throbbing pulse that seemed to synchronize with the ticking of the grandfather clock. Each tick, once a comforting heartbeat of my home, now felt like a small hammer blow against my skull. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through it, to will it away with the same quiet determination that had gotten me through a lifetime of challenges. Raising a son, earning a doctorate, running a school, burying a husband. But this was different. This wasn't a challenge to be met with grit. It was an invasion. The pain began to spread, a hot, searing liquid pouring through the channels of my mind, blurring the edges of the room and turning the familiar, comforting hum of my house into a discordant, high-pitched shriek. The photographs on the wall seemed to warp and mock me, their smiling faces twisting into grotesque masks of indifference. The sweet, heavy scent of the roses drifting in from the open window turned cloying and suffocating, making my stomach churn. A wave of nausea washed over me, and a cold, primal fear, the likes of which I hadn't felt since the night I found Robert collapsed in the hallway, seized my heart. This wasn't just a headache. This was something else. This was something terrifying, a monster awakening in the quiet rooms of my own mind. The pain was a living thing now, a malevolent entity that had taken root deep inside my skull and was spreading its thorny vines with brutal efficiency. It coiled and writhed, sending blinding white-hot flashes of light behind my eyes with every frantic beat of my heart. The world I knew had compressed into a narrow, shimmering tunnel of agony, the edges dark and threatening to collapse. My breath came in ragged, shallow gasps that did little to fill my lungs. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of glass, sliced through the dense fog of pain. I needed help. I needed my son. My hand, trembling and clumsy as a newborn colt's leg, fumbled for the cordless phone on the end table. My vision was so blurred that the keypad was just a smear of numbers, but my fingers knew the way. Muscle memory, honed by decades of love and worry, found the familiar sequence for Michael's cell. I pressed the call button, my ear straining to hear the ring over the roaring that had filled my head, a sound like the ocean trapped in a seashell. 1 ring. 2. 3. Each one an eternity, a small lifetime of hope and dread. Then the click. The cheerful, disarmingly professional sound of his voicemail greeting filled my ear. You've reached Michael Johnson. I can't take your call right now, but please leave a message and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. As soon as possible. The words hung in the air, a meaningless corporate platitude in the face of my raw, desperate need. I couldn't leave a message. A sob thick with despair and pain tore from my throat and I slammed the phone back into its cradle. With a surge of desperate, irrational hope, I immediately picked it up and tried again, praying that this time would be different, that he'd see the immediate call back and know something was wrong. It wasn't. Voicemail. The finality of it was like a door slamming shut in my face. My mind, frantic and splintering, raced for another option. Oh, of course. She was always on her phone, a sleek rose gold extension of her perfectly manicured hand. She juggled calls and texts and emails with an efficiency that both impressed and intimidated me. She would answer. Had to. I found her name in my phone's directory, my thumb slipping twice on the slick plastic before I managed to place the call. The phone rang, a different, more melodic tone than Michael's, a series of tinkling chimes that sounded utterly absurd in my current state. It rang and it rang and it rang, the cheerful little song mocking my escalating terror. Finally, her own breezy voicemail message took over. Hi, you've reached Nicole. Sorry I missed you. Leave a message and I'll get back to you. Have a fabulous day. Fabulous. The word was a cruel joke, a diamond-hard little piece of glitter thrown into the gaping maw of my suffering. I didn't have the strength to feel anger, only a hollow, cavernous despair. My grandchildren, Jordan and Jasmine, my last hope. They were teenagers, perpetually glued to their devices, their thumbs a constant blur across tiny screens. Surely one of them would pick up. I dialed Jordan's number, my heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs. It went straight to voicemail. Not even a single ring. He'd blocked my number or his phone was off. I didn't know which was worse. With my last ounce of hope, I tried Jasmine. Her phone rang once, a brief, hopeful chirp, then stopped. A moment later, a text message alert chimed on my own cell phone, which lay on the table beside the landline. With a monumental effort, I reached for it and squinted at the screen. It was an automated response from her phone. "Can't talk RN in class." In class. Of course. They had their own lives, their own worlds, their own obligations. Worlds in which a grandmother's sudden, terrifying crisis didn't register, didn't even cause a ripple. The silence that followed was more profound, more absolute than any I had ever experienced in that house. It was a crushing physical weight, the sound of my own abandonment. I was 72 years old, a woman who had dedicated her life to her family, a woman who had hosted every holiday, remembered every birthday, and offered unconditional love at every turn, and in my moment of greatest need, I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The realization was a physical blow, as devastating as the relentless pain in my head. They weren't just busy. They were unavailable. To me. A new feeling, colder and harder than panic, began to push through the agony. It was the chilling clarity of a truth long suspected but never faced. The world outside my living room window, with its familiar oak trees and the neighbor's cat sunning itself on the sidewalk, was moving on without me. No one was coming. No one was going to ride to my rescue. If I was going to survive this, I would have to be my own savior. The thought was both terrifying and strangely, fiercely empowering. My entire life I had been the rescuer, the fixer, the one who soothed fevers and mended broken hearts, the principal who guided thousands of children safely through their formative years. I had never imagined a day when there would be no one to call for me. With a surge of adrenaline that momentarily eclipsed the pain, I forced my trembling fingers to move one last time. I swiped across the screen of my cell phone, my vision clearing just enough to find the keypad icon. My fingers, steady now with grim purpose, didn't dial a loved one. They dialed the 3 numbers that strangers always answer. 911. As I spoke to the calm, disembodied voice of the dispatcher on the other end of the line, giving my name and my address in a voice that sounded strangely distant, a profound and irreversible shift occurred deep within my soul. The foundation of my world, built on the bedrock of family, had crumbled into dust. And in its place, something new, something harder and more resilient than tempered steel, was beginning to form. The emergency room was a symphony of controlled chaos, a brightly lit, sterile world of beeping machines, hushed, urgent voices, and the sharp, clean scent of antiseptic that clings to places of sickness and fear. I lay on a gurney in a small, curtained cubicle, a thin, scratchy blanket pulled up to my chin, feeling like a piece of driftwood washed ashore after a violent storm. The blinding, relentless pain in my head had finally subsided to a dull, manageable throb, thanks to the medication a kind-faced nurse had administered through an 4-drip in my hand. But the ache in my heart was a fresh, gaping wound that no medicine could touch. I felt untethered, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's more visible emergencies. The curtain that separated me from the rest of the world was a flimsy, pale green barrier that did little to muffle the sounds of a child wailing in the next bay or a doctor delivering grim news in low, somber tones to a weeping family. In this sterile, impersonal space, my own crisis felt small, insignificant, yet it had consumed my entire universe. And the loneliness was a physical presence, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. With a final flicker of that stubborn, foolish hope that refuses to be extinguished even in the face of overwhelming evidence, I reached for my cell phone, which a kind paramedic had placed in a clear plastic bag with my purse. My fingers, still clumsy and weak, typed out one last message, a final, desperate flare sent up into the darkness of my family's silence. I sent it as a group text to Michael, Nicole, and both the children, hoping that the gravity of the words might finally break through their wall of indifference. In the ER at Atlanta General. Severe headache. The doctors are running tests. I'm scared. I didn't add details. I didn't beg or plead or demand their presence. I just laid the unvarnished truth out, plain and vulnerable, a final offering of my heart. I laid the phone on my chest, the cool glass a stark contrast to the frantic, unsteady beating of my heart. I watched the screen, waiting for the 3 little dots that would signal a reply. A sign that someone, anyone, cared enough to type a few words of comfort. The minutes stretched into an eternity. I watched the clear liquid in the 4-bag drip, 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 counting the drops, each one a tiny measure of my fading hope. I must have drifted off, lulled into a light, uneasy sleep by the medication and the sheer emotional exhaustion of it all. I was startled awake by the buzz of my phone against my sternum. Relief so potent and overwhelming it made me dizzy flooded through me. They'd gotten the message. They were coming. They were worried. My thumb swiped across the screen to unlock it, a smile of forgiveness already forming on my lips. The message was from Nicole. It was not what I expected. The words glowed on the screen, each one a perfectly formed little dagger of casual cruelty, aimed with precision at the most vulnerable part of my soul. "We are on a family vacation. Please don't bother us and stop being so dramatic." I read the message once, twice, a third time. My mind simply refused to process it. It was like trying to read a foreign language, the meaning of the familiar words slipping through my grasp, refusing to cohere into a recognizable sentiment. Vacation? They were on a family vacation? Michael hadn't mentioned a single word about a vacation. The secrecy of it was a betrayal in itself. And then there was the final devastating accusation. Dramatic. Stop being so dramatic. For years that had been Nicole's favorite refrain, her go-to weapon, a subtle but effective tool to dismiss my feelings, to invalidate my concerns, to shrink me down into a caricature of a needy, attention-seeking old woman. When I'd worried about Michael's stressful workload after he'd lost a major account, I was being dramatic. When I'd expressed profound loneliness during the first Christmas after Robert died, I was being dramatic. When I'd mentioned that the house felt too big and quiet for one person, a clear hint that I craved their company, I was being dramatic. It was her way of reframing my legitimate human emotions as a character flaw, a performance for an audience I didn't have. And now here it was again in its purest, most brutal form. I was in a hospital bed, alone and terrified, my body still trembling from a medical crisis, and my pain was just drama. A performance to be ignored. The text message did what the blinding headache could not. It broke me. A dry, silent sob shook my entire body, a tremor that started deep in my soul and radiated outwards. There were no tears. The hurt was too deep, too fundamental for tears. It was a profound seismic shock that rearranged the entire landscape of my heart, leveling the structures of love and devotion I had spent a lifetime building. The love I had poured into my family for decades felt like a fool's investment, a treasure squandered on people who saw it only as a burden. The foundation I thought was built on mutual love was, I now saw with blinding clarity, built on my utility, my convenience. And I, Loretta Johnson, had just become very, very inconvenient. The flimsy curtain to my cubicle was pulled back with a soft swish of plastic. I expected a nurse coming to check my vitals, but instead I saw the face of my dearest friend, Brenda Smith. Her neatly coiffed silver hair was slightly askew, and her face, usually so composed, was a thundercloud of worry and righteous anger. She must have called the house, gotten no answer, driven by and seen my car still in the driveway and started calling the hospitals. That was Brenda. Loyal to the bone, a force of nature in a sensible cardigan. She took one look at my face, at the phone still clutched in my hand like a weapon, and her eyes narrowed with the practiced diagnostic skill of a retired nurse. "Loretta? Honey, what is it? What did the doctor say? Where is that no-good son of yours?" I couldn't speak. The words were trapped behind a wall of grief. I simply held the phone out to her, my hand shaking. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. I watched her read the message. I saw the confusion melt away, replaced instantly by a flash of pure, unadulterated fury that made her formidable chin jut out. Her lips tightened into a thin, hard line. She looked from the phone to me, and in her dark, intelligent eyes, I saw not pity, which would have broken me further, but a fierce, protective fire that mirrored the one just beginning to smolder in my own chest. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't make excuses for them. She simply handed the phone back to me, took my hand in both of her warm, strong ones, and said with the quiet conviction of a judge delivering a verdict, "That woman is the devil in a designer dress. And Michael is a fool for letting her hold the leash." In that moment, her unvarnished, validating anger was the only medicine I needed. A doctor, a kind-faced young woman with tired eyes, entered then holding a clipboard. She smiled gently. "Mrs. Johnson? I have your test results. Everything looks good. Your CT scan is clear. What you experienced was a severe hypertensive crisis, likely brought on by stress. Your blood pressure is stable now. We'd like to keep you for observation for a few hours, but you should be able to go home tonight. The diagnosis was a key turning in a lock. It wasn't a tumor. It wasn't an aneurysm. It was stress. The stress of being lonely, of being ignored, of being taken for granted. The stress of loving people who didn't know how to love me back. And with that diagnosis came a liberating realization. I was not dying. I was not dependent. And I was done being dramatic. Brenda drove me home from the hospital a few hours later, the city lights of Atlanta blurring past the car window. She had insisted on staying, fussing over me with a gentle but firm authority that I found immensely comforting. She had spoken to the doctor, gotten the discharge papers, and filled the prescription for my blood pressure medication at the all-night pharmacy. She was a whirlwind of competence and care, a stark contrast to the echoing silence from my own family. As we pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my house, dark and silent under the soft glow of the porch light, hit me in a way it never had before. It didn't look like a sanctuary. It looked like a mausoleum, a beautiful, stately tomb filled with the ghosts of a love I had foolishly believed was reciprocal. The quiet that greeted me as I stepped inside was no longer the gentle hum of memory. It was the cold, flat silence of abandonment. Every object seemed to mock me. The family photos on the mantel with their smiling, carefree faces felt like a gallery of lies. The armchair where I waited for calls that never came seemed pathetic. The dining table, set for a Sunday dinner I had hoped to host, was a monument to my own naivete. This house, this beautiful prison I had so lovingly maintained, was not a home. It was a stage, and I was the unpaid, unappreciated caretaker, waiting in the wings for a cast of characters who had moved on to another show. Brenda made me a cup of chamomile tea and sat with me at the kitchen table, her presence a warm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of my thoughts. "You know what this is about, don't you?" she said, her voice soft but direct, leaving no room for illusion. I knew, of course. I had known for years on some deep subconscious level, but I had refused to let the ugly truth surface. I had papered over it with excuses and hope. "The house," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Brenda nodded grimly. "The house. This prime piece of Collier Heights real estate. Nicole's been salivating over it since the day Robert died. She sees it as her retirement plan, her ticket to the next level of her oh-so-fabulous life." It was true. Nicole, the luxury real estate agent, spoke of my home not with affection, but with a cold, appraising eye. She talked about its good bones, its curb appeal, and most tellingly its market value. She and Michael had long ago stopped asking if I needed help with the upkeep and started making suggestions for upgrades that would increase its resale value. They weren't trying to make my life more comfortable. They were polishing their inheritance. They were waiting for me to die. The thought, so stark and brutal, didn't even make me flinch. It felt like the final missing piece of a puzzle I had been staring at for years. They didn't see me, Loretta, their mother and grandmother. They saw a stubborn, inconvenient placeholder, a life tenant in their future asset. Nicole's text message wasn't just a moment of casual cruelty. It was a strategic dismissal. My health crisis was an annoyance, a drama that threatened to delay their plans, to remind them of the inconvenient human element at the center of their financial projections. A strange, cold calm settled over me. The grief and the shock had burned away, leaving behind something hard and clear and diamond bright. It was the clarity of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I looked at Brenda, my oldest and dearest friend, the only family I had left, it seemed. "They think I'm a fool," I said, my voice devoid of its earlier tremor. "They think I'm a weak, dramatic old woman who will just sit here and wait to be disposed of." Brenda's hand covered mine on the table. "And what are you going to do, Loretta?" she asked, her eyes searching my face. A smile, the first genuine smile I had felt in what seemed like a lifetime, touched my lips. It was not a happy smile. It was a smile of grim, liberating purpose. "I'm going to prove them right," I said. "I'm going to be the most dramatic woman they have ever met." The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The house was still quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. I showered, dressed in my sharpest suit, the one I used to wear for school board meetings, and did my hair and makeup with a meticulous precision I hadn't bothered with since Robert's funeral. I was no longer a grieving widow or a lonely mother. I was a principal again, and I was about to take control of my school. My first call was not to my son, but to a man named Arthur Vance, a sharp, ruthless probate and estate lawyer whose name I'd gotten from a retired judge in my book club. I explained my situation in clear, concise terms, leaving out the emotion and focusing on the facts. He listened patiently, and when I was done there was a brief pause. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum of professional appreciation, "it sounds to me like you're ready to rewrite your final chapter. I would be honored to help you hold the pen." My second call was even more satisfying. I looked up the top real estate agency in Atlanta, the one that was Nicole's biggest competitor. I asked for their most successful agent, a woman named Cynthia Bell. When she came on the line, her voice brisk and professional, I made my request. "Ms. Bell," I said, a thrill of pure, unadulterated rebellion coursing through me, "I would like to sell my house. And I would like to sell it as quickly as humanly possible." There was a beat of silence, and then, a voice that was suddenly much warmer, much more interested. "Mrs. Johnson," she purred, "I do believe you've called the right person." The following days were a whirlwind of focused, exhilarating activity. Cynthia Bell, a chic, razor-sharp woman who moved with the speed and precision of a hummingbird, descended upon my house with a team of stagers, photographers, and landscapers. She was the anti-Nicole in every way. Where Nicole was dismissive, Cynthia was attentive. Where Nicole was condescending, Cynthia was collaborative. She saw the value in my home not just as a property but as a place that had been loved. She listened to my stories about Robert's garden and incorporated them into the marketing materials. But she was also unsentimental. "We're not selling memories, Loretta," she said, her eyes kind but firm. "We're selling a dream to a new family. Our job is to make it impossible for them to resist." While Cynthia worked her magic, I began my own operation. I called an estate sale company and instructed them to liquidate everything. The furniture we had picked out together, the china I had used for countless holiday dinners, the books Robert had collected over a lifetime. A part of me ached at the thought of letting it all go, but a larger, more powerful part of me felt a profound sense of liberation. These were not just objects. They were anchors, tying me to a life that was over, to a version of family that had proven to be a fiction. The estate sale was a surreal experience. Strangers wandered through my home, picking through the artifacts of my life, their voices a low hum of commerce. I watched a young couple, their eyes full of hope, by my dining room table. I saw a woman lovingly wrap my grandmother's china in newspaper. I felt a pang of sadness, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of rightness. These objects deserved to be part of a living, breathing home, not relics in a museum of my disappointment. The house sold in 4 days. A cash offer well over the asking price from a young doctor and his wife, who were expecting their first child. They wrote me a letter, telling me how they had fallen in love with the garden and how they couldn't wait to raise their family within its walls. Their words were a balm to my soul. The house wouldn't be a teardown for a developer or a flip for a greedy agent. It would be a home again. The closing was scheduled for the end of the month. The speed of it all was breathtaking, a testament to Cynthia's skill and the desirability of the life Robert and I had built. As the for sale sign on the lawn was covered with a bold red "sold" banner, I felt a surge of triumph so fierce it almost brought me to my knees. It was a direct, public refutation of Nicole's entire professional world, a move she would undoubtedly see and understand as the strategic masterstroke it was. I was not just selling a house. I was dismantling a legacy they had taken for granted, and I was doing it right under their noses, while they were sunning themselves on some sandy, oblivious shore. The final days in the house were stark and hollow. The rooms, stripped of furniture and photographs, echoed with every footstep. The ghost had been exorcised. It was no longer my home. It was just a property, a shell waiting for a new life to fill it. The emptiness didn't feel sad. It felt clean, like a slate wiped clear. On the last day after the movers had taken the few personal items I had chosen to keep, my books, my mother's jewelry, a single perfect photograph of Robert and me on our wedding day, I walked through the empty rooms one last time. I stood in the doorway of Michael's childhood bedroom, remembering the little boy who had believed I was the strongest, smartest woman in the world. I stood in the living room, remembering the Christmas mornings and the birthday parties. I allowed myself a moment of grief, not for the house but for the family I thought I had, the love I thought was real. It was a necessary farewell. Then I hardened my heart and turned to my final task. I sat on the floor in the center of the living room, using a moving box as a makeshift desk. I took out a single sheet of my best cream-colored stationery and my favorite fountain pen, the one Robert had given me when I earned my doctorate. My hand was perfectly steady as I began to write. The note was not long, nor was it emotional. I had spent a lifetime on emotion and it had gotten me nothing. This was a document of facts, a final, irrefutable accounting of their actions and my own. I did not yell or accuse. I simply reported. I wrote about the blinding pain and the terror. I wrote about the desperate, unanswered phone calls. I quoted Nicole's text message verbatim, the cruel words stark and damning in my elegant cursive script. Then I detailed the consequences. I explained that the house, their presumed inheritance, had been sold. I stated, in the clear, unambiguous language of my lawyer, that all of my assets, including the proceeds from the sale and Robert's life insurance, had been placed into an irrevocable trust. The sole beneficiary of this trust, I wrote, was me, Loretta Johnson, for the duration of my life. Upon my death, the remaining principal would be donated in its entirety to a selection of charities dedicated to supporting abandoned and neglected senior citizens. I signed my name at the bottom, the ink a dark, definitive slash on the page. I folded the note, slipped it into a matching envelope and wrote a single word on the front: family. I walked to the grand fireplace, the centerpiece of the room, the place where they had so often gathered to celebrate holidays while dreaming of the day it would be theirs. I propped the envelope squarely in the center of the mantel. It looked small and innocuous, but I knew it was a bomb waiting to detonate. I took one last look around the empty room, took a deep breath that felt like the first clean breath I had taken in years, and walked out the front door, not bothering to lock it behind me. I got into the waiting car service that would take me to my new life, a vibrant, sun-filled apartment in a luxury senior living community on the other side of the city. As we pulled away from the curb, I did not look back. Their return was exactly as I had pictured it, a scene I had played over and over in my mind with a grim, satisfying clarity. They would have come from the airport, tired and irritable from the flight, their skin tanned from the Bahamian sun, their suitcases bulging with duty-free liquor and souvenirs. They would have been bickering, probably about the cost of the trip or the traffic on I-285. Their first stop before even going to their own home would be mine. Not out of concern, but out of a sense of proprietary obligation, a box to be checked. "We should probably stop by and check on Mom," Nicole would have said, her voice laced with the weary sigh of a martyr, as if visiting her own mother-in-law was a Herculean task. Michael, ever the path of least resistance, would have agreed immediately. They would have pulled into the driveway, their casual annoyance at my drama, still a fresh, unexamined wound. And then they would have seen it. The first sign that the world they had left a week ago had irrevocably tilted on its axis. The stark, bold, impossible to misunderstand sold sign on the lawn. Not just for sale, but sold. A done deal. A closed chapter. I can imagine the silence in the car, thick and sudden. The bickering would have stopped, replaced by a stunned, slack-jawed disbelief. Nicole's perfectly made-up face would have gone pale under her tan. Michael's easygoing expression would have hardened into a mask of confusion and dread. Even the children in the back, absorbed in their phones, would have looked up, sensing the sudden sharp shift in the atmosphere. They would have stumbled out of the car, their luggage forgotten on the curb. They would have walked up the familiar brick path, their steps hesitant as if approaching the scene of an accident. The house would have looked the same, Robert's roses still blooming defiantly in the garden, but the sign on the lawn would have screamed a different reality. It was a declaration of war from a battle they didn't even know had been waged. They would have found the front door unlocked, another unsettling detail in a world suddenly full of them. The echo of their own footsteps in the empty foyer would have been the next shock. The absence of the grandfather clock, its steady ticking, the heartbeat of that home for as long as they could remember, would have felt like a death. They would have moved from room to room, their disbelief turning to a cold, creeping horror. The bare walls, the empty floors, the ghostly outlines in the dust where furniture had once stood. It was a scene of total, systematic erasure. It wasn't just a house that had been sold. It was a life that had been packed up and removed, leaving nothing behind but a hollow, echoing shell. And then in the living room they would have seen it. The single cream-colored envelope, propped on the mantel like a final, damning piece of evidence at a crime scene. The word family on the front would have felt like an accusation. Michael would have been the one to take it, his hands trembling slightly. Nicole would have stood too close, her sharp eyes trying to read over his shoulder, her impatience warring with her fear. He would have opened it, the sound of the tearing paper unnaturally loud in the silent room. And he would have read. The camera of my imagination zoomed in on their faces, a slow, merciless pan across a gallery of shock and dawning comprehension. I could see Michael's face crumbling as he read my account of the unanswered calls, his own negligence laid bare in his mother's elegant script. I could see the flash of defiant anger in Nicole's eyes as she read her own text message quoted back at her, her casual cruelty immortalized on the page. And then the final devastating paragraphs. The sale of the house. The irrevocable trust. The charities. The complete and total disinheritance. It was a masterclass in legal and emotional finality. There were no loopholes, no room for negotiation. It was a door slammed, locked, and bolted from the other side. The note would have fallen from Michael's numb fingers, fluttering to the dusty floor. The silence that followed would have been broken by a sound of pure, strangled fury from Nicole. The sound of a predator realizing the trap had snapped shut not on her prey but on herself. Their vacation was over. Their future, the one they had so carefully curated at my expense, had just been cancelled. Days later, my son appeared at the door of my new apartment. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was pale and unshaven, and his eyes, the same warm brown eyes I had gazed into since the day he was born, were filled with a desperate, pleading anguish. He had clearly bypassed the front desk, probably telling them he was my son, a title he now seemed to be clinging to like a piece of wreckage in a storm. My new home was a stark contrast to the scene of his desperation. It was a bright, airy two-bedroom apartment in a building that hummed with life. The living room was filled with sunlight, and the balcony overlooked a beautifully manicured courtyard where other residents were laughing and chatting. I had my books arranged on new shelves, my mother's jewelry sparkling in a case, and the single perfect photograph of Robert and me on a table by the window. It was smaller than my old house, but it felt infinitely larger, filled not with the ghosts of the past, but with the promise of a future. He stood in the doorway, momentarily stunned by the elegance of it all, by the clear evidence that I was not just surviving but thriving. "Mom," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside, my heart a cold, still stone in my chest. I felt a flicker of the old maternal instinct, the urge to comfort him, to smooth the worry from his brow, but I extinguished it with a will of iron. That woman, the one who lived to soothe his pains, was gone. He sank onto my new sofa, his head in his hands. "I don't understand," he mumbled. "How could you do this? Without talking to me? Without giving me a chance to explain?" I sat in the armchair opposite him, my posture erect, my hands folded calmly in my lap. "Explain what, Michael?" I asked, my voice even and measured. "Explain why you didn't answer your phone when your mother was in the middle of a medical emergency? Explain why you were on a secret vacation you didn't bother to tell me about? Or perhaps you'd like to explain why your wife felt it was appropriate to call me a dramatic burden while I was lying in a hospital bed." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a pain that for the first time seemed genuine. "I didn't know about the text, Mom. I swear. Nicole handles all the travel plans, the messages. I didn't see it until we got back. If I had known. If you had known what?" I pressed, my voice still quiet, but with an edge of steel he had never heard before. "What would you have done differently, Michael? Would you have cut your vacation short? Or would you have simply sent a more polite text message before going back to the beach?" He flinched as if I had struck him. "It wasn't like that," he stammered, the words tumbling out in a desperate, incoherent rush. "Nicole, she's been under a lot of pressure at work. He's trying to make partner. She thought you were just lonely, that you were exaggerating." "Exaggerating," I repeated, the word a cold, dead thing on my tongue. "I was in the emergency room, Michael. My blood pressure was high enough to cause a stroke. But in your wife's professional opinion, I was merely exaggerating." He finally broke. Tears streamed down his pale cheeks, the tears of a boy who had been caught, who had run out of excuses. "I'm sorry, Mom," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I've been a terrible son. I let her get between us. I let her convince me that her ambition was more important than my own mother. But I can fix this. We can fix this. We'll buy a condo near you. We'll see you every week. The kids miss you. Please, Mom. Don't do this. Don't cut us out. You're my mother. He was appealing to a memory, to the woman I used to be. He was playing the only card he had left. My love for him. And it almost worked. My heart ached to see him so broken. But then I looked past him at the photograph of Robert and me, at the life we had built on a foundation of mutual respect and unwavering support. And I knew what I had to do. I will always be your mother, Michael, I said, my voice softening with a genuine aching sadness. And I will always love you. But love isn't a blank check. It doesn't excuse neglect. It doesn't erase cruelty. You and Nicole made your choices. You chose your vacation. You chose to ignore my calls. You chose to believe I was a burden. And choices, Michael, have unavoidable consequences. This is the consequence. If Michael's visit was a plea for mercy, Nicole's was a declaration of war. She arrived 2 days later, not with the tear-stained desperation of her husband, but with the cold, coiled fury of a predator. She didn't beg to be let in. She strode past the concierge with an air of entitled authority and appeared at my door, her knuckles rapping a sharp, impatient rhythm against the wood. When I opened it, she pushed past me into the apartment, her expensive heels clicking in aggressive staccato on the polished hardwood floor. She was dressed in a severe blood-red power suit, her face a mask of perfectly applied makeup that couldn't quite conceal the rage burning in her eyes. She surveyed my beautiful new apartment not with admiration, but with a contemptuous sneer, as if its elegance was a personal affront. "So this is what you've done," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. "Sold our children's birthright to move into this glorified hotel for old people. I hope you're proud of yourself." I closed the door quietly and leaned against it, my arms crossed. I refused to be intimidated. I was the principal of this school, and she was a student who had been sent to my office for a very serious infraction. "My grandchildren's birthright," I said, my voice calm and even, "was a grandmother who loved them. A birthright you encouraged them to squander. And for the record, I am immensely proud of myself." Her eyes narrowed into slits. The thin veneer of civility cracked and fell away, revealing the raw, grasping greed beneath. "You think you're so clever, don't you, Loretta? You think you've won. But you have no idea who you're dealing with. I have already spoken to my lawyer. We are going to have this entire ridiculous transaction overturned." I raised an eyebrow, a gesture of mild curiosity that I knew would infuriate her. "On what grounds, Nicole?" "On the grounds of diminished mental capacity," she spat, the words ugly and sharp. "It's obvious. A confused, elderly woman, distraught over a minor health scare, is manipulated by a predatory real estate agent into selling her primary asset against her own best interests. A classic case of elder abuse. We'll have you declared incompetent. Michael and I will be appointed as your legal guardians, and we will undo this entire mess. We will get the house back." It was a stunningly audacious strategy, a desperate, vicious attack designed to terrify me into submission. She was going to use the very narrative she had created, the story of the confused, dramatic old woman, as a legal weapon against me. The sheer, breathtaking cruelty of it almost took my breath away. But I had anticipated this. My lawyer, Arthur Vance, had warned me that this would be her next move. He had called it the last resort of the greedy and the desperate. And we were prepared. I let the silence stretch, watching her chest heave with ragged, angry breaths. I let her believe for a moment that her threat had landed, that I was scared, that she had found a crack in my resolve. Then I pushed myself off the door and walked calmly to the small, elegant writing desk in the corner of the room. I picked up a thick leather-bound portfolio and turned back to face her. "Incompetent," I said, my voice still quiet, but now laced with an authority she could not mistake. "That will be a difficult case to make, Nicole. Especially for you." I opened the portfolio. "You see, my lawyer, Mr. Vance, is a very thorough man. He anticipated that you might try something like this. So we took a few precautions." I pulled out the first document and held it up for her to see. "This is a full psychiatric evaluation, conducted last week by Dr. Alana Matthews, the head of geriatric psychology at Emory University. She has declared me to be of exceptionally sound mind, with cognitive functions well above average for my age group. She is, of course, prepared to testify to that effect in court." Nicole's face, which had been flushed with rage, began to pale. I pulled out a second document. These are the complete itemized phone records from the day of my minor health scare. They show 4 unanswered calls to my son, 2 to you and 1 to each of my grandchildren, all placed within a 15-minute window. They are followed by a single successful call to 911. It paints a very clear picture of a woman in distress, desperately trying to reach a family that was, shall we say, unavailable. I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. I pressed my advantage. "And this," I said, pulling out a printout of her text message, the words stark and damning in bold black ink, "is the message you sent to a 72-year-old woman who had just texted you from an emergency room. I wonder how a judge will interpret the phrase, 'Stop being so dramatic.' Do you think they'll see it as the words of a concerned, loving daughter-in-law?" She was speechless now, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, no sound coming out. But I wasn't finished. I had saved the best for last. "You see, Nicole, a legal battle would be messy. Your reputation as a high-powered real estate agent is built on an image of trustworthiness and integrity. An accusation of financial elder abuse, especially against your own mother-in-law, would be devastating. The press would have a field day with it. But I decided to add a little insurance policy just in case." I smiled, a cold, sharp smile that held no warmth at all. "Last week, I made a rather substantial donation to the Atlanta Benevolent Fund for Elder Support, one of the city's most respected charities. A 6-figure donation. It's to establish a new wing in their outreach center, dedicated to providing legal and social services for seniors who have been abandoned or exploited by their families." I paused, letting the words sink in. I had them put up a small plaque at the entrance to the new wing. It reads, "Generously funded by the Johnson family in honor of Loretta Johnson." I watched the last vestiges of color drain from her face. I saw the moment of absolute, soul-crushing defeat in her eyes. He finally understood. It wasn't just a battle she couldn't win. It was a war I had made unwinnable. If she sued me, she would be suing the beloved benefactor of a prominent local charity. She would be publicly attacking the very woman whose name was now synonymous with elder advocacy in the city of Atlanta. Her career would be over. Her social standing would be destroyed. I had not just protected myself. I had built an impregnable fortress around my new life, and I had used her own family name to do it. "Now," I said, my voice soft as silk, "I believe you were saying something about my incompetence?" She stared at me for a long moment, her face a mask of pure, impotent hatred. Then, without another word, she turned and fled, her clicking heels a frantic, panicked retreat from a battle she had already lost. The months that followed were a renaissance. The departure of my son and his family from my life left a void, but it was not a painful one. It was a clean, quiet space that I could finally fill with my own life, my own joys, my own voice. My new home at the Sterling Senior Community was not an endpoint. It was a launch pad. The label senior living was a misnomer. It was simply living, and I embraced it with a passion I hadn't felt in decades. I joined the book club where fierce, intelligent debates over literature raged late into the evening, fueled by coffee and a shared love of words. I took up watercolor painting, something I had always wanted to do but never had the time for. My first attempts were clumsy and amateurish, but the simple act of mixing colors on a palette and watching them bleed into the paper filled me with a quiet, profound joy. I discovered I had a knack for it, a good eye for the way the light fell across the petals of a flower or the complex geography of a wrinkled, smiling face. Brenda, who lived just 10 minutes away, was a constant, welcome presence. We had dinner together at least twice a week, exploring new restaurants in Decatur and Buckhead, laughing until our sides ached. We planned trips, real trips, not the carefully managed, family-approved excursions of my past. We booked a river cruise down the Danube, a trip to see the fall colors in New England, and a weekend getaway to the spas in Asheville. We were two 70-something women, charting our own course, accountable to no one but ourselves. It was intoxicating. My new community became my new family, a family built not on the accident of birth, but on the solid ground of shared interests, mutual respect and genuine affection. There was George, a retired history professor who could talk for hours about the Civil War. There was Maria, a former chef who taught a weekly cooking class where I learned to make a perfect paella. There was a whole group of us who started a morning walking club, our lively conversations echoing through the manicured paths of the community gardens as the sun rose over the city. I was no longer just Michael's mother, or the widow Johnson. I was Loretta, the woman with the surprisingly sharp wit, the one who painted beautiful watercolors, the friend you could count on for a thoughtful opinion or a shared laugh. I was a person in my own right, seen and valued for who I was, not for what I represented or what I could provide. One afternoon, about 6 months after the final confrontation with Nicole, I received a letter. It was from my grandson Jordan. His handwriting was a boyish scrawl, but the words were surprisingly mature. He wrote that he was sorry. He said he hadn't understood what was happening, that he had just followed his parents' lead. He told me that his parents were getting a divorce, that the house of cards Nicole had so carefully constructed had finally collapsed under the weight of her own bitterness and greed. He asked if maybe he could come and visit me sometime. Just him. I wrote back immediately, my heart aching with a love that had never truly faded. I told him that my door was always open. The future of my relationship with my grandchildren was uncertain, a path to be navigated with care and honesty. But for the first time it would be on my terms. My story closes not in a large empty house filled with the ghosts of expectation, but here on my sun-drenched balcony, a paintbrush in my hand and a canvas in front of me. I am painting the roses from Robert's garden, not as a memorial to a life that is over, but as a celebration of the enduring beauty and resilience of a life that has, against all odds, bloomed anew. I have traded a legacy of property for a legacy of peace. I have learned that the most valuable thing a person can own is their own self-respect. I'm not lonely. I am free. And I have never ever been less dramatic in my life. Now, I'm curious about you who have listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to reclaim your own peace? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching.